All right, hi, everyone. We'll go ahead and get started. I'm sure a few more people will join, and we'll let them in as they join the session. I'm Saeed Chaudhry. I'm the Associate Dean for Research Data Management in the libraries here at Johns Hopkins University. Welcome to today's talk by Sarah Novotny. I know we have people from within Hopkins, but even beyond Hopkins, so it's great to see such a diverse mix of people who are going to join us today. I think that speaks to the great interest in hearing what Sarah has to say. In addition to my role in the libraries, I'm currently leading a newly formed and launched open source programs office out of the library, or an OSPO. Some of you may be familiar with that concept, but if you're not, it's something that's been used in the corporate and industrial setting and private sector setting. And we are looking to see how such a construct might work in an academic or university setting. And there are some things that are common. OSPOs typically help raise the institutional capacity to support open source programs throughout the institution. So we're doing things like we've created an enterprise account for GitHub. The whole institution is eligible to join that. We are also working with other units within the university, for example, the Technology Ventures, the Technology Transfer Group, to look at open source licensing. But fundamentally trying to support the faculty and the students and even the staff of the university who create open source software and to do so in a more formalized and institutional manner. In addition to the OSPO, we are also reaching out into educational activities through the Institute of Applied Open Source, which is a partnership from the OSPO and the Department of Computer Science. We're very pleased that the current chair, Randall Burns, has agreed to work with the OSPO through this institute and create so-called semesters of code. So you're probably familiar with hackathons, which tend to be, for a weekend or something of that nature. Google, of course, had its Summer of Code program. We're looking at semesters of code being, in some sense, maybe a natural evolution. So a longer, deeper, intensive experience for students as part of their academic experience, working with real world open source software and directly interacting with the community of developers and users that are involved in that software. As part of the build up to that semesters of code in fall of 2021, today is the first official event of the Institute. So in many ways, Sarah, thank you for helping us launch the Institute of Hopkins. I couldn't think of anyone better, quite frankly, to do that. But we also have an intersession course taking place in January from Stephen Wally. So we're fortunate not only to have one, but two executives from the Azure Office and Microsoft. Stephen has been very helpful in working toward the OSPO and the Institute. I'd like to turn it over to him to introduce Sarah. Just a couple of reminders, if you could stay on mute and turn the video off. I think that would help with just the overall sort of performance of the session. If you have questions, please do put them in the chat. I believe Sarah will try to address them if she can during her talk, but for obvious reasons, if there are too many, we'll probably try to organize them and cluster them for discussion after the presentation is over, but feel free to put your comments and questions there. And the session is being recorded, just so that you know. So the recording of the presentations and the chat is also being done. But with that, I'll turn it over to Stephen so he can introduce Sarah and we can hear what she has to say.
Hi, welcome everybody. My name's Steve Wally, and as Saeed just said, I also work in the Azure Office of the CTO. I've had the pleasure of knowing Sarah for a number of years now. She's a longtime open source champion in projects such as Kubernetes, NGINX and MySQL. She is part of the Azure Office of the CTO at Microsoft, and she sits on the Linux Foundation Board of Directors. Prior to coming to Microsoft, she led an open source strategy group at Google. And Sarah has run a large-scale technology infrastructure long before we started talking about things at web scale. So please welcome Sarah Novotny, and I will turn it over to her.
Thank you, Stephen. And I will go ahead and share my screen and also remind everyone that questions in the chat window is great, in part because I'm happy to incorporate them as we go through talking, but also because we have lots of other really amazing open source people here watching this and participating, and who can help answer questions as well. So I would not expect that that we would not have our questions happily answered. So between myself and the other open source professionals in here, please just throw the questions into the chat and we will see if we can get them answered for you. So as Saeed mentioned, and really started all of this, this is the intersection of an open source programs office and computer science department, engineering department, getting together and working into open source and understanding and trying to figure out how the universities can get benefits from working within open source, and then of course how universities and then the students and the professors and faculty around the university can get benefits from open source. So there's a whole lot of culture change to talk through in all of this that is being undertaken at Johns Hopkins, and that is so exciting to see. So I'm thrilled to be here and talk about open source and be a resource to all of you as you start on this journey. So let's talk about open source. So let's agree on some common language. One of the things you find most often when someone says, what is open source, is they go, oh, it's licenses. And this is true, there are open source licenses, and those open source licenses are approved and agreed upon by a group called the Open Source Initiative. And the Open Source Initiative manages the number of conformant licenses to the open source definition. And that's all very exciting. Okay, not really. It's not really that exciting for me, at least. I don't like licenses. But we have fantastic help in Open Source Programs Office with legal groups around any of our institutes and who can help choose the right license. The only thing that most of you really need to know or understand about licenses is the difference between a copyleft license and a permissive license. Most corporations, I'm presuming, but don't know yet how the academic industry will work, but most corporate lawyers prefer permissive licenses, and that aligns better with corporate engagement. It aligns better with the open source definition, and it's a little bit different from the free software definition, which aligns better with the copyleft licenses. So those are things to know. It's not a quiz by any stretch, and it's not something that you'll have to spend a lot of time on. It's just a good thing to know when you talk about open source. So open source is a licensing model, and a licensing model that functionally allows for multiple contributors, cross-organization, collaboration, and then also engagement with our software trademark, software copyright, as well as the trademarks around anything that you want to work with. Now, all this said, open source, I said that's the part that you don't have to pay that much attention to, and we'll get good guidance from other people such as the OSPO. But what the important part of open source is, in my opinion, is that it's a development model. And that development model is very different from how corporate, how many or most corporate engineering teams evolve software, as well as how it's different from academics who develop software. It is a much more public engagement, and it is one where it is almost all text-based. In most cases, it's usually done in a content, not a content management system, a source code repository of some sort, so that you have historical information about who has made what changes. You all now have GitHub Enterprise, and that seems like a great spot to collaborate, but of course it is not the only place to collaborate. So this development model has been handled for some of the model, for some of the specifics by tools, of course. But the real challenge always in open source and in building this applied open source office, as well as an open source programs office inside a university, you're going to learn a lot about open source culture and people, because all of our tech is going to change. Our tech has changed in the last 10 years, and our tech is going to keep moving. And what you know today is not a promise of a job in 5 years. This industry continues to move, and most people I know who move into technology do that in part because they are rewarded by learning new things. And so the pace of innovation inside technology is actually a benefit for those people who are excited about that. But that being said, the technology is not usually the hard part. We all love to learn, we all engage with it, we learn it, and then it changes. So what is the difficult part, in my opinion, around open source? That's people, because as it turns out, people are non-deterministic, and that is a challenge when you're trying to bring together a group of people who are working together on a project, and they may have different goals, or maybe they work for different divisions of the university, or maybe their grants require them to show innovation in different ways or show success in different ways. And so you spend a lot of time aligning interests across projects as you're building open source projects. And this ends up being a culture for your open source project. So you have to work with the group and the teams that you develop, encourage and invite others to participate with you, and make sure that you are developing a project whose position in the world is open and inclusive and engaging and wants to work with people. Now, there's frequently a tension in this. We've seen it a lot in industry, because you have an engineer who is generally rewarded, especially if it's an earlier career engineer. That engineer is generally rewarded on metrics that look like lines of code. It isn't really lines of code, but it might be changes made, or it might be reviews done, but they're not necessarily rewarded. And I think there's a parallel in academia, that you're not necessarily rewarded for, say, bringing other companies into this project, or making the culture of this project really good, so that the project and the community moves faster because it's high trust. That's really hard to reward. And as you are looking at moving to use more open source as a goal against the strategy of technology transfer, you need to make sure that that alignment happens, so that you can align the reward system for faculty and students with the asks of working in open source. Because when this works well, it works really well. It works astonishingly well. And it ends up in a space where you can build things that as an individual you could never do, or even as a single company or a single research institution you could never do. You can make industry-wide impact. And that's the power of open source. And that's why building a team and a group and a strength in being able to engage with contributors, encourage them and empower them to participate in your open source, have open and collaborative discussions, even if they cross institutional boundaries, makes for a stronger project. And I hope, but you all will have to prove out, deeper learning from the research that is being done and collaborated on. So as I've said, I've done most of my work so far in industry. And so I want to talk about one of my favorite projects and most recent projects. So I just want to see a show of hands. How many of you have actually heard of Kubernetes? You should be able to pop little hands up, right? Let's see if I can see the little hands. That's the next question. More, show me the chat. Okay, so it seems like several of you have, maybe not a lot of you. I'm not sure where I'm seeing it on here. So Kubernetes is a orchestration platform for Docker containers, or more broadly speaking, containers. Now, that alone is interesting. I mean, containers were a pretty big revolution in the mid 2010s about how to package and share and engage with applications to deploy and run large-scale applications in the cloud specifically. And that's super nifty, but we wanted to make sure that there was also a business reason, because you don't necessarily start with a project out in the open. You can, but you don't necessarily start with a project out in the open without knowing where you'd like it to go. So Kubernetes began at Google, and the idea and the big strategy behind Kubernetes was to change the industry conversations that were happening. So for those of you who weren't, deeply embedded in technology industry news in the mid 2010s, at that point, independent software vendors were frequently being asked to offer their software in AMIs. And an AMI is an Amazon Machine Image, which is a specialty VM. It's a VM, but it's got some extra special sauce from Amazon on there. But what this meant was when a customer would come to an ISV and say, hey, NGINX, you've got this super cool piece of software. Do you have an AMI with it? Those questions led to just a presumption. There was a very interesting moment in that because it presumed Amazon. It presumed that the customer was going to run it on Amazon and AWS. There wasn't room for Azure and Google Cloud Platform to make space in this industry. So we had to change industry conversations. And changing those industry conversations from VMs as a portable workload unit to containers as a portable workload unit was a lot of effort. And it was not something that was going to happen fast. Generally, we see these shifts happen over 5 years is sort of the shortest end of it. 10 years is more reasonable. And then, by the time you get to 12 or 15, you're sort of on an ebb slide and your technology is not necessarily being used as much. Now, there are obviously projects that are countercyclical to this, and there are other projects that last a very, very long time, some that flame out. But on the whole, there is a software life cycle that happens, and that there's, that there are early adopters, and then you have an early majority, and so on. We wanted to make sure that with Kubernetes and the advent of Docker, we were moving the industry as quickly as we could to containers, away from the AMI VMs. So that requires a lot of things. And the fastest way to change a group of people and the way they think about something is to get them to think that it's their idea. So we really needed to bring in cross-industry collaboration. And we really needed the industry to think that Kubernetes was their idea, was partly their idea, that they had skin in the game, that they knew that they contributed to it, that they felt part of that community and felt that there was a place in a world that was using containers and Kubernetes for them, for their company, for their career. And that cross-industry collaboration is, for me, what really made Kubernetes special. That work was done to make Kubernetes the first thing that people put on their LinkedIn profile or on a resume. They say, I work on Kubernetes, or I'm a contributor to Kubernetes. Oh, and I've also worked for these other companies. Being able to participate in a project or something like this applied open source office, or specific projects that you may work in within Johns Hopkins, having a feeling and a sense of camaraderie and team and tribe around that is very important. Now, you all are adding additional complexity because you're looking to go not only across industry, actually I should reverse that, not only across academia, which you understand quite well how to collaborate in, and then the question is, do you also want to move out across industry and also participate with municipal collaboration? So these These are, in fact, different cultures that you will be able to use and participate with and learn from, because that new perspective of the industry or that new perspective of municipalities will help you have more empathy and engagement with your end consumer of a piece of software. Now, that consumer might be an open source user. That consumer might be a customer someday when you work in industry again. And you also end up having to stretch yourselves and learn about these different ways to contribute and engage with a project, because it's not all coding. There is a whole lot of work, just about the same amount of work that you have that goes into, you know, developing industry level software example or customer product, or you might have team leadership requirements and needs. Like this is not just about writing code and putting it out on the internet. This is very much about engaging with a group and developing something together, making this again greater than the sum of its parts. Because if you bring in those diverse perspectives and you talk through all the different things that they do that you do not actually have a ton of familiarity with, then you end up learning and growing. And that learning and growing and participating and opening up of the walls of academia to start permeating out into open source and working more with industry and participating more, I think will give a lot more opportunity, very different opportunity, but a lot more opportunity for that technology transfer. There's a great example from the history of open source, which is fun to repeat. So there was a research project called CF Engine in the 90s. And that research project was in fact being worked on to manage fleets of servers through configuration management. And that project came out of an academic institution and was used by several industry companies. And eventually those people that were working in those companies using CF Engine over the next 5 to 10 years, several of them went out and developed a competing product outside of the CF Engine project. And that gave birth to both Chef and Puppet, as well as SaltStack and Ansible, as companies that were developing how to manage configurations on servers at scale. So if we could work all together and start, say, 10 years earlier or 20 years earlier, because the 90s was much earlier than Puppet or Chef was created. But if we start working with academia and bring the academic rigor and the academic computer science research with intersecting with industry, where building for scale and building for growth and building for customer use cases ends up being a much, much more powerful outcome than just an academic research piece of code that is a proof of concept, or even might be fully formed, but doesn't scale to the degree that most of the industry expects and needs at this point. So there's all of this opportunity for the open source Programs Office and the Institute for Applied Open Source to figure out a new paradigm for collaboration using the framework of open source culture in order to bring greater value back to your universities and greater connections with the industry, which of course helps students, helps professors, helps engage companies with universities and so on. So again, I go right back to that positive sum game. One of my favorite components about open source is if you do it right, there's space for everyone, and there's a way to amplify and grow the impact of these projects and this research that you're all doing in a way that will be that much more impactful. So let me bring this around to 2020, because this is a year. Let me just say, this is totally a wacky year. For those of you who have started school this year on video, and yes, this is just another video, I'm very sorry. And what we're seeing from industry and from customers is that 2020 and coronavirus are the biggest instruments of digital transformation that we have found with our customer base in the last many, many years. So this is a huge point and a huge opportunity for change, disruptive change. We have been very disrupted here already in 2020. So let's use this disruption and have positive outcomes out of it. Grow a super well-grounded, well-connected Institute for Applied Open Source. Have that institute participate, engage with, and reach out to industry, to municipalities, to get a broader perspective on these research projects that you're looking at. Take things from just a one analysis view of a data set to a multidisciplinary view of a data set, and work with and across your disciplines and across your even silos of industry to academia to municipalities. Work across all of these divides, see the other perspectives that you may not be seeing, that you may not have visibility into, and then improve and make better both 2021 and the world and software that you're developing as you are researching and investigating things in the university. There's such a huge opportunity here that I always want to end on positive notes of the world is a strange place this year, and it will continue to have echoes of that going forward. But one of the most important pieces of open source is empowerment. And as I can help empower you to say, this is cool, and you have lots of resources. We have Denise Cooper on the call, who is a longtime mentor of mine, as well as one of the early open source leaders. We have Stephen Wally here on the call, and that he works with me in the open source, in the Office of the CTO at Microsoft, doing similar work. We have lots of deep experience in the industry and are here as resources for you all as you take off on this super exciting journey. So you all didn't come up with very many questions while I was talking through this. People are welcome to come off mute and ask questions.
Sarah, if I might take the prerogative of one of the instigators of this, and I again just want to thank you so much for sharing your insights into this journey, which I think has a tremendous amount of relevance, quite frankly, in the academic context. And wanted to ask you a couple of questions. One from perspective of students. Mm-hmm. And I should mention, I'm actually an alumnus of Hopkins. I should also mention that every time I interact with a student now, they call me sir, so it's been a while. But I think some things are still the same. And one of them is that, Hopkins is not unique in this way. It's a very competitive environment. And I think students basically come into it, even if they're not competitive when they come into it, come out with a sense of, I have to prove that I'm better than my classmates.
Yep.
And I'm curious, and as you say, it's not just you, we have, some real considerable expertise from the open source world on this session. Mm-hmm. How you and others would react to sort of that classic interview stance of a student saying, I'm the best coder you've seen, right? That's why you should hire me. As opposed to, I'm a good coder. I'm not here to tell you I'm the best you've ever seen, but I've worked in an open source setting. I've worked in a team setting. I know what it means to collaborate. Just how you would react to those two different, you know, when we interview, we sell ourselves, right? So how you'd react to those two different sort of pitches.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. And I love asking questions that dig into that in interviews as well, because someone who is one-dimensional, the best C coder out there on the planet, or I guess Java is more often taught these days, the best Java coder on the planet out there with a huge specialty, you know, hours of work, but is not necessarily familiar with or comfortable with the collaboration around code or review quality or humility and partnership and peer work within any piece of software, I get very nervous. So being able to say, this often was alleviated through internships with companies. So you may be the best academic person, here are my grades, that's great, but I've also had these 2 or 3 internships, and those internships show that you can collaborate and that you have engaged, because you'll get something written up for that. I think one of the best parts about open source is all of the work that happens on the whole is public. So when someone says, you know, you can just check out my GitHub, you can go look at how a person responds to you know, an intermediate level question in the wrong form, you know, in the wrong place, or you can see how they coach someone else on, you know, code standards for a project. So you actually get a much broader both experience by working in open source, as well as within an interview setting, a lot more to talk about other than the simple, you know, I did these things for my classes, or, you know, I have these specific homework assignments. You actually get more real world experience that translates better, in my opinion. Saeed, do you have your hand up? It is, you are yellow. But you are muted.
Sorry about that. I see Denise's hand is up. I'm not sure if she was going to add something to that or ask a question. And then we do have a question in the chat, a couple questions in the chat we can get to. But Denise, were you going to say something?
That was left over from when she asked for hands up. By the way, that's where the hands live, is in the participant list. And there were a lot of hands showing when you asked about Kubernetes.
Oh, good. That's awesome to hear. I was in the complicated space of having PowerPoint in presentation mode and Zoom in presentation mode, and I lost the hands.
It's problematic. I wanted to say that there's a little bit of a conversation going on. I started it when you were talking about the thought process that went into the way that Kubernetes was rolled out and shared with the world, and how it was special in that way. I basically said, you know, you guys may be wondering the extent to which this kind of maneuvering actually happens. And the answer is that's what we do. That's what Sarah and Stephen and I do. And so now somebody's asking about the Thief Engine story and how deliberate was the engagement with those companies, or was it more organic?
It was definitely more organic, although over time, Mark started engaging more and working with inbound pull requests. They weren't even pull requests at the time. This was well before GitHub and Git. But he was working with requests and inbound code changes in order to help meet the needs of the industry. But it was one of those things that the adoption in the industry was a lot more organic. There was not a concerted effort to try to go from the research work he was doing to a product, which is more what Puppet and Chef did. They rewrote, having learned from CF Engine, they rewrote their own models, one of which was a more pull model and one of which was more of a push model. And they ended up with 2 very different companies doing very different types of configuration management. And then even 5 years after that, there was a second generation, or a third generation, if we count CF Engine as a first generation. There was a third generation of configuration management with Ansible and SaltStack. And I'm sure I'm missing other smaller players and possibly even very large players, but those were the ones that I was remembering in that.
Right. So sometimes that stuff is organic and sometimes it's mapped out. In my case, when I draw up a strategy, usually it's quite mapped out, but I know that nobody's going to believe me. Like that just happened with the COVID app, right? I knew exactly where I wanted to send it, but I couldn't give everybody the whole picture because they weren't going to believe me. So I had to sort of wait until the next pebble dropped so I could jump onto it.
Yep.
Right. So yeah, it's interesting that way. Okay, we also have a question from Vina who wants to know if we could talk about building a culture around an open source project and how you get collaborator buy-in.
Thank you, Vina. This is so important. There are multiple ways to do this, like building any culture of a team, a class, a group that's working together, of volunteers. There are many ways. The way that I have found most fluid is probably a better way a best way to describe it. The most fluid is to propose and then have the community or the collaborators or the contributors all come participate, same as you do with like a new feature request for comment. You go out and you say, hey, this is what I'm kind of feeling in our culture. Do you all agree that this is where we want to go? I gave a talk in 2017 at KubeCon about the values of the Kubernetes project. And we built those, and we published them in that keynote about 3 years after the project started. I would argue that that was a little bit late. We probably should have pulled them together a year or so earlier, but we were watching them bubble up from the community. And then we really wanted to make sure that when we talked about them, we could show examples of where the community was demonstrating that value. And then we now can use that for decision process, or within our decision process. So for example, one of the values is distribution is better than centralization. So if we had someone who had a bunch of leadership positions already within the community and they raised their hand to do something, we could say a huge thank you to that person and then ask if they would be willing to be a mentor for someone new in order to make this a broader group of people who are leading. So we want to decentralize this process. We can use that for decision making on a technical question, like, do we believe that this control plane should have some single point of failure, or do we need to make sure that we are breaking this up in a way that both makes sense and allows us to fail gracefully? So we use these values in order to make both cultural and technical decisions. And that is having that value set as an underpinning, I find to be incredibly helpful in setting a culture. Stephen has worked with a group recently where he describes it as holding the pen tightly to set the culture and making sure that we talk about how we have peer accountability. This isn't a matter of, Stephen or Denise or I have to approve something. It is, if you all can agree, you need to agree, write down what your arguments were for and against, how you came to the decision, and then off you go. Making these projects be self-sustaining with a long-term intent and engagement is one of the things that will make these projects live a long time. For little experimental research projects, very different, but they may come together as a set, and that set may find itself having a community around it. Or you may have, I think of R and all of the research that happens around R and all of the different published notebooks for Python, same idea. All of these things that are not necessarily driving a community for every published notebook, but you can find a lot of community around Jupyter notebooks or Python notebooks. So you have both a user community that you're developing as well as a contributor community, because the contributor community of Python, for example, or Jupyter is different from, but intersects with, the user community for that group.
You know, Sarah, it's interesting that you talk about R, because in a real sense, R did everything wrong. There were 13 contributors. When I was involved with R, they had just added a 14th contributor, and they'd been working on the project for 20 years, right?
Yeah.
Like the amount of control that went into the core engine was not how you would do it normally, right?
Yep.
But they were re-implementing a known standard, so in a way it was more like the Linux kernel than it was like Kubernetes, right?
Yeah.
But they did build an extensible architecture that allowed all the action to happen out at the modules.
Yep.
And that marketplace was super fluid.
Yep.
Right.
Yeah.
So yeah, that R happens to be a really interesting example. So now someone named L. Hagen has asked, similar to Vina's question, I've seen people be intimidated to join an existing open source project because of the learning curve, both culture and logistics of how to contribute. How would you help folks through that?
I would suggest, and this is the way I actually approach new communities every time I do, I would suggest going and watching the primary mailing list or chat channels or Twitter hashtags or however that project communicates. I would go watch that. Most larger projects today have a page in their GitHub repository. It's not always easy to find, but there's usually a page that talks about the contributor, where the contributors gather to talk and make decisions and think through things. And watching and looking for cultural cues in that, as well as learning the people and who they engage with on a regular basis is the starting point. That gives you a little bit of culture. You get to also watch and participate in a discussion. Even if it's a small comment, you could just put in a discussion point or ask a question about how they've made a decision. These sorts of smaller touch points give you an opportunity to interview that project just as that project is engaging with you. So I find that a lot of projects these days are working toward having clear on-ramps for new contributors. So they have a page saying, you know, here's what you need to set up your environment, or here are issues that are good for first-time contributors, or here's how we would love for you to appear in our community and we can help you. Or they have mentoring programs. So a lot of larger projects are really actively seeking to engage with new people. So appearing, listening, learning, and then starting to ask and participate while identifying yourself as a new participant. I have found that most projects are good to engage with you that way.
So, Sarah, if I can add, I mean, music to my ears, and I will say that the semesters of code that I'd mentioned at the beginning is a pathway that we are looking at Hopkins in the educational context, but we're hoping it can be a model, quite frankly, for other universities. And one of the important things to keep in mind is just a lot of the lessons and guidance you just provided. We're looking to start with Hopkins open source projects. We hope to eventually branch out into broad community open source projects. For the first pass, we're looking at projects where we know sort of the owners and the stakeholders that are working on those open source projects. It's in the context of an academic experience. We are looking for different layers of mentorship, you know, to the point you were saying, all the way from student mentors who, you know, you have a different relationship when one of your peer students says something, to the instructor, right, who is officially running the course and so on. So we're trying to build a lot of that scaffolding. And one of the things I'm hoping that the OSPO can do is to build that sense of community at JHU, a very inclusive and open community. One of the prices, the only price of admission I will mention is that if you have a JHU email address, I will send you one email asking if you want to join a list we've set up open source list at Hopkins. We can have a Slack channel, we can have other communication channels where we can start to have this kind of conversation within the Hopkins community and feed that into these semesters of code so that it's not, and I don't mean this in a bad way, but it's not only the educational experience, it's how you participate in a project starting a year beforehand, right?
Right.
It's this nice gradual kind of process. So it's not that you register, of course, and then suddenly you're thrown in the deep end and you feel like, I don't even know where to begin.
Part of what's brilliant about the semesters of code design is that they're projects you control. You're not trying to deal with the, get into Mozilla or the Linux kernel and try to land a contribution. Those are pretty daunting at this point to get into. And so I think, and it's also pisses off the open source community at large every time an academic institution tries to hijack their agenda, right? So, so this is going to work better. It pushes your agenda and also offers some opportunity. Jacob, can I have a face?
Oh, yeah.
Also offers some opportunity, right? So I think that's pretty smart. And I think that will become a pattern. But then you're going to have the added complexity of, I want everybody to collaborate with me, like on the JHU COVID data thing. You probably have lots of other universities that would love to collaborate on that through this lens, and figuring out how to make that work is going to be interesting. We do have one more question that's a left turn, which is from Eric. He says he's curious about the advantages and challenges of taking a somewhat mature non-open source project that has established use and then making it open source.
Denise is laughing for many reasons. One of which is this is where she started.
Yeah, it is not easy. It's just not.
It is not easy. Yeah, it is not easy for a number of reasons. One, most of them are practical. A few of them are cultural. Let me go through the practical ones first. Practically speaking, you have to go back and find everyone who's contributed to it in any way before and get their permission to change the licenses on it, which is often a thing. Two, moving out of a proprietary and closed build system is often a huge hassle. So we've talked at Microsoft about different things that we might want to open source, even, things that we no longer support because they've just moved past their, lifetime. And we have investigated this, and untangling it from an internal build system in order to open source it is extraordinarily difficult work. Like that's a lot of work without a lot of return. So to Eric, the first thing I would ask is would you like to get out of open sourcing it if you had that opportunity? And if it's more use, there may be ways to do that in sort of a hybrid model as opposed to just straight trying to open source it.
So one of the problems that I see when we do this is more cultural. The people who've been writing the thing are pretty used to being the only people that write the thing.
Yes.
And they usually don't have great collaboration. It's almost always a very hierarchical situation. Mm-hmm. So just making enough oxygen for new people to be able to breathe in is a relatively big ask. And there are some strategies you can use to change that. But for instance, when we did Open Office, that team had worked together for 15 years already, and they were still in the same office. We didn't move them. They're still sitting in the same office. So, and it was 8 million lines of code commented in German. So they're having conversations in German in their offices and making decisions in hallways that then don't get documented, and the rest of the world is left out of that decision loop completely. There were lots of things like that we had to fix, and one of the things we did was we moved a big chunk of the release management to a different country in a different time zone to force them to communicate asynchronously, at least with that other team, right? And in writing. And there are gambits you can use. They work eventually, but it is a long slog to get an existing extant team of any history to actually work as a functioning open source team. Open Office never achieved it. There were other goals for that project, so it wasn't bothering us that they didn't achieve it. But you'll notice that the LibreOffice community almost immediately after the Oracle acquisition said, yeah, we're not going to assume that Oracle's going to be better at this than Sun. It's time for us to just do our own thing. And they weren't wrong about that. So they forked the code base and did, the right thing, right?
Yeah, I'd like
I think
to.
Stephen has his hand up.
Yeah, I was just going to
Yeah.
add, building on that idea. There's also mature software has an architecture, and the architecture can best be called a ball of mud, depending on how mature it is. And okay, I will start my video.
Say mature, do you mean fermented?
Yeah, well, that's a good way to look at it. And when you watch some of the very large successful open source projects that have evolved, they start small, they get big, and there is this moment in their history where they all have kind of this complete refactoring moment because they've realized they can't grow any farther. And so they refactor, and then things continue to grow in a more structured way. And that typically happens as more and more people participate. So you end up with this very clean architecture that may have been messy for a while, but with something that has not gone through that kind of very public engagement. Every single decision was done for a good reason, and it becomes a ball of mud. Every mature piece of software that doesn't have that constant stress of being refactored for broad consumption ends up in this horrible place. And so a lot of that pain to make something understandable that a community could even look at is trying to figure out how to refactor it into something that's buildable for folks. But that also goes back to what Denise and Sarah were saying. What's the goal? What are you trying to do when you take this existing mature code into an open source community? Is it to build community around it? Are you chucking it over the wall? Are you simply trying to create an artifact for people to understand history? There's lots of different goals there. But if you're going to try, if build community is one of those things, you've got a technical architecture problem.
Yeah, thanks for that, Stephen. There's more questions in the chat. I know Denise is responding to one of them. And it's related to this question, Denise's earlier comment about academic institutions sort of asserting themselves. And this question is about big egos in the open source world. And, of course, we don't have big egos in universities at all. But, one of the most interesting things I've learned in the few months I've been working is with the open source community is these neutral forums, right? Where that Googles and the Microsofts and the Amazons of the world are just equal players. And I think we really need that in the higher education and academic sector. We need universities to come together in that way. And we typically try to do that through grants and things like that, or workshops, or, a funder putting us together. But I think, and just full disclosure, one of the groups I've been talking to is the Eclipse Foundation is one of those possible places where this kind of thing can happen. Is can we have a neutral forum where we come together and we're not immediately trying to compete with each other, but we're trying to find out how we can collaborate and work together. So I think there's another question. We should have time for one more.
Yeah, we've got the one from Kent, which Denise is doing a great job of answering.
Andrew, your video's on. Did you have a question?
No, I didn't. I had to be in another meeting, so I came late. Should I not have my video on?
No, it's totally fine.
Thanks.
We just want to make sure you didn't have a question, that's all. Are there any other questions for Sarah?
I'm done typing
Anyone?
that one if somebody wants to.
Thank you, Denise.
You're welcome.
No, thank you, because as I said, it's being recorded, so we'll have the transcript of the chat as well. But yeah, I did want to give a chance for one more question if people have anything for
Actually,
not just
can I
Sarah.
say, if I can say one thing that's a small
Sure.
encapsulation of what I typed, a lot depends on how you set up the community in terms of tone and ego. A lot depends on how you model behavior. And in just little things like making it a standard practice for people to say hello to first-time loggers on. reminding people to treat each other nicely and rewarding people that do that well, can make all the difference. And what you ideally want is people who, although they are senior and have a right to an ego, choose to park it at the door. So making that be the most attractive thing will create the kinds of communities you're looking for.
No,
We also set
very useful to hear.
expectations. Yeah, we also set expectations within a lot of the communities that I work in that you are elected. And so you actually have to be representing the community and the contributor electorate in a way that, you know, your leadership is rewarded through being elected. And for example, within Kubernetes, we've had 4 sets of steering committee elections every October-ish. It happens, and each year several seats rotate, and we bring in a little bit of new blood. And we also were able to do a really nice succession from the group that founded the project and built the early governance. And then we're able to hand that off to a steering committee where we as those who are building the original governance are now just advisors to the project. We are not active, many of us are not active day to day, but we still pop in every so often with an opinion, and, you know, the whole community respects that, you know, that we are there as references as well. But we know that it's not our project to lead right now. We could help people with their positions in it, but it's not our project to lead right now. I actually sent an email just saying that I'd be happy to do such and such, but I'm not day-to-day active. And let me be clear, I'm not trying to do this. I'd rather be a mentor to one of you taking this role. And it was well received. And I thought that was super cool.
Well, we are getting close to the hour. So I want to respect everybody's time, but I definitely want to thank Sarah again. Thank you so much for speaking with us, and not only the presentation, but your comments and observations afterward. And Stephen, Denise, and everyone for taking the time. I hope this is the beginning of a conversation that takes place at Hopkins, and it's sort of the initial seeds for really building an open source community and a capacity within the institution. Some of the problems that we as universities are trying to address in concert with others are so large we can't do them alone. And to Sarah's point, COVID has accelerated the need for that in a very significant and substantial way. So thank you again. Appreciate everybody joining. And as I said, I will be in touch with the Hopkins folks with at least just one email. And if you remain interested, certainly we'd like to keep in touch with you. So thanks again, and have a good afternoon.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Hey, Sarah. Nice to see you.
Hi, Denise. Good to see you. And Stephen and Kent, and I saw Art.
Yeah, I saw lots of people too.